Hello, I'm Dina Bass Williams, and we are excited to have you join us for this live broadcast. We have been looking forward to this conversation. We have been anticipating this conversation. The HBCU community is extremely important to us. We have a number of people on this broadcast who happen to be HBCU students and HBCU alums. I am not one of them, and but I will say that for my entire life, I have understood the importance and the power of HBCUs. And my sister Dee Dee Bass Wilbon, who's also on this live stream, she and I formed a fellows program, the Humphrey Pinkston Fellows Program, to support HBCU students, and we have our two inaugural HBCU fellows, Bernila Sparks and Dorian Francis, on this call. Dorothy Humphrey Bass is, in full disclosure, our mother and also attended Morris Brown College. So the HBCU community has long been important to our family. We are four generations of HBCUs. We understand the impact, the power of HBCUs, and we're extremely excited to have today Adam Harris, whose book inspired this conversation. And we're going to bring Adam in just a moment. I just want to really quickly tell you about BPA Livewire and Bond Girl Books. Those are the organizations that are sponsoring this conversation. BPA Livewire is a African American newswire that celebrates the diversity of thought in the public square, founded by the Bass sisters, me and Dee Dee. And so we hope that you will subscribe to bpalivewire.com. And again, we celebrate diversity of thought in the public square, and that is a free newswire service. We also encourage you to check out Bond Girl Books. We are a community of readers and writers celebrating the written word. We have virtual events, virtual book clubs, and in-person book clubs. But again, we are so excited that Adam Harris, author of The State Must Provide, is going to join us. And I mean, he may not realize it, but he is a rock star in our community. So let's get applause. When we got the email last week that he was going to be able to just pop in, and we know that you're extremely busy, but when we got that email, the entire clan was super excited. So thank you so much. And we're going to have, actually, Dorian is going to introduce Adam.
Thank you. Thank you. So as an HBCU student myself, I'm particularly thrilled to introduce our distinguished guest today, Adam Harris. What makes this occasion even more special is the fact that Adam, the author of The State Must Provide, is a proud graduate of an HBCU himself, Alabama A&M University. As a rising senior at Bowie State University, I'm excited to follow Adam's writings. Adam is an accomplished author and a prominent voice in the field of education. He joined The Atlantic in 2018 after an impressive tenure as a reporter for the Chronicle of Higher Education, where he focused on federal higher education and the challenges faced by HBCUs today. Of course, today's conversation is inspired by his book, The State Must Provide. Adam, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So I'm going to just jump right in and begin by asking you to share us what has the responses been to your book from the HBCU community and from PWIs as well?
Yeah, it's been interesting. Thanks, for everyone for having me. It's been interesting over the last couple of years because I think as, HBCU alum, you could sort of see some of the issues around campus, right? If maybe it's a dorm that might be a little bit older, maybe it's potholes that it's like, oh man, there was a dorm at the campus of A&M that had been it was being renovated when my mom was on campus, and it was still being renovated when I got to the campus. And there were, of course, buildings that had renovation issues even longer than that. And it's been interesting to see the ways that people can connect, the issues that I saw on my campus don't stem alone from, the administration wasn't doing their job. They weren't trying to do X or O, right? There's a legacy of discrimination there that led to some of these issues and the continuance of these issues, right? If you think about a place like Kentucky, where they had been examining the underfunding of Kentucky State almost since Kentucky State became an institution when it was Kentucky Normal and Industrial School. You fast forward today and you still see some of the same issues, the green spaces that'll flood and won't drain right. And it's because the state has never lived up to its responsibility to fund the institution in an equitable manner.
So, Adam, you cover a lot of history in your book, and we found it very interesting that, first of all, the history that's covered, the universities that we did not know anything about, the universities, I mean, there's obviously some major cases, but what was the most challenging part about digging in and doing the research?
I think one of the most challenging parts is that, as a reporter, I usually get to talk to people, right? I'm talking to people just like on a day in, day out basis. In some of these instances, I was having to reconstruct people's lives through personal letters, through, in the case of Lloyd Gaines, right? The young man who was trying to attend law school. I was effectively having to reconstruct his life through the letters that he was sending to his family, digging into the archives at Lincoln University, and trying to make sense, right? He does have a couple of descendants who are not immediate relatives, but, second cousins, third cousins, great nephews, that are still alive, and they're still trying to make sense of what actually happened to him. So sort of reconstructing those characters just from the bits and pieces that I was able to pull on them from their personal letters, from the stuff that they ultimately wrote, was probably the most difficult. But also sort of sitting with some of those, some of the stories and thinking about how similar some of it was, right? The fact that some of these students, they were just trying to get that education, and Ada Louise Sippel Fisher, for example, right? When her and her classmates went into the president's office to make the call to their local representative and say, hey, just come to campus, right? You'll see that the green spaces are flooding. That sort of urgency around the issue to say that we know something is wrong here, and we know that there is a responsibility there, and we're just trying to see those needs addressed.
And I want to remind the folks who are watching on Facebook and YouTube that you can ask questions in the comments, and both Didi and I are monitoring those questions. But team, any questions for Adam? I have some more if you don't.
I have one. I know, Adam, I know you probably know about the Morris Brown debacle, right?
Yes.
Yes. What do you think? What do you think about the hard reset and Dr. Kevin?
I think that several institutions, right, are going through this sort of period, right? If you look out in Tennessee, you have a couple of institutions out there that are also going through needing a fresh start. And I think that, for the legacy of what these institutions have done historically, what they can still do in an environment where they have the resources, so that there's that old adage, right? It's really expensive to be poor. And so for institutions that were without money, who were trying to make that $5 stretch into $10 as they were trying to keep their institutions afloat, that was incredibly difficult. And I think that people may be looking at these universities, these institutions that are trying to, effectively have a phoenix story, right? Where they're trying to rise from the ashes where they were before. I think that people will have a new lens to understand the situation of those institutions, rather than just jumping to blame former administrators for the woes of the institution.
Adam, so I'm a graduate of Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. And when you talk about the students going into the president's office, and they were praying for rain that day so that they could see what they actually needed to have on campus. I remember driving up to Fisk, and there were windows broken out in the back of the dorms and everything. In terms of funding PWIs and HBCUs, what's realistic? What's a realistic solution, you think, in terms of leveling things out for HBCUs and PWIs?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. It's of course different for public institutions and private institutions, right? There was, of course, a point where where state governments helped out private institutions that ultimately became public, predominantly white institutions. You think about the University of Tennessee, for example. Um, but you know, in terms of private institutions, you've already started to see over the last couple of years this increase in philanthropic giving. Now we know, and history tells us that that is not something that we can 100% rely on as historically Black colleges. You think in the early to mid 1870s, early 1880s, you had this large push from the American Missionary Association to help fund institutions, but you also saw, late 1880s, early 1890s, that support for interracial education or Black education in particular sort of died off. So we've seen the ways that philanthropic giving sort of crests and wanes. But I think in terms of what we can reasonably expect, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect the federal government to live up to its obligation to hold states accountable for their lapses in funding institutions equitably, right? In North Carolina, this is a story that actually didn't make it into the book, but in the late 1970s, David Tittel, who was effectively the head of the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, now the Department of Education, went to North Carolina to effectively say, okay, what's going on here? I've heard there's a disparity amongst your public institutions. And he points to these autoclaves, right? These high-tech pressure cookers that they use to sterilize laboratory equipment as a prime example of the ways that North Carolina A&T and North Carolina Central in particular had been underfunded in comparison to North Carolina State University. And he says, so at North Carolina State, they have 40 of these autoclaves. Between North Carolina Central and North Carolina A&T, there are 3. Wow. Right, and that's just a small microcosm of this larger problem that the state has with funding. And so the state goes back and forth with the education department. They're like, okay, well, this is our settlement offer, and the department's like, no, we don't accept that. But then the Reagan administration comes in, right? This had been the Carter administration. Reagan administration comes in and quickly settles with the state of North Carolina. David Tittel ultimately gives a quote to the Washington Post where he says, this settlement doesn't read like a desegregation plan. It reads like a joint U.S.-North Carolina defense of everything the system did. And so we have sort of these settlements that have happened over time that have, in some ways stymied what is sort of feasible, but several of these states haven't lived up to those settlements, right? North Carolina was supposed to get to 10% Black enrollment at North Carolina State and UNC Chapel Hill. That never happened, but the agreement sunsetted. And so since they didn't meet their obligations, the federal government can go back in and investigate those states. There's still 5 states that haven't proven that they desegregated their higher education system. Maryland was the 6th, but of course they just settled with the Black colleges there a couple of years ago. And so I think that there is a possibility that you see funding pushes to get things leveled, even if they're the sort of modest addressing of the legacy as they've done in Tennessee, or push to do with Tennessee State, or the sort of ambitious packages that you've seen folks like Denise Smith at the Century Foundation propose, where she was saying that HBCUs deserve something like a $40 or $50 billion endowment just for the institution so that they're able to plan for the future. So the conversations are happening. It's just a matter of how aggressive advocates for the institutions can be in terms of pulling back some of that funding that has been withheld from them.
So, Mr. Harris, I have a question.
Yes.
So being from like a small HBCU like Voorhees University, we have under like 3,000 students. Do you think that the state even knows about what we go through? Like, do you think they even recognize? Because it only can go so far. Like, I know that I'm in the Student Government Association. I know we have complained about the shower heads, how the bathroom community, how it looks, but it only can go so far. You know what I'm saying? Do you think they understand from a small university? standpoint? Because in the state of South Carolina, it's like you got Claflin and South Carolina State. Of course, they're gonna get noticed, but like us, let's see, Miles and is it Miles? I'm not sure.
In Alabama.
Speaking for Voorhees specifically, do you think that the state notices and feels what we go through?
You know, each institution has their sort of lobbyists in the state house, right? The folks who are sort of pushing for their institutional priorities. But I think that one of the big problems is that, you know, and this is, you know, also a problem with sort of state boards. I often talk about the institutions for higher learning in Mississippi, for example, where if you looked across the board seats a couple of years ago, before I ended up writing a story about how the board was predominantly graduates of Mississippi State University, University of Mississippi, and Southern Mississippi, and how those institutions miraculously ended up getting a large share of the sort of discretionary pie. I don't think that there is a misunderstanding of what the institutions go to. I think that oftentimes lawmakers don't feel the pressure to change anything. You know, and we've seen this sort of bear out in several different ways over, you know, the last century plus, where they'll say, oh, well, that's not our problem to fix now. It's on the institution to fix the problem. If they can't fix it, well, that's their fault, not necessarily realizing the ways that state and federal lawmakers contributed to the current situation of the institution. I don't know if that 100% answers the question, but I think that there's a knowledge of the issues on campuses, but they don't feel the pressure to fundamentally change things at as aggressive of a rate as they probably should.
So, Mr. Harris, I got a question. Obviously, you went to Alabama A&M, and I think I read as of 2021, Alabama has the most HBCUs in the country. So I want to know how that experience was like for you, kind of being in a place where there was, you know, so many HBCUs around, and, you know, how was your experience at HBCU personally?
Alabama A&M is the best college in the nation.
Of course.
So I, you know, even as I wear a St. Aug sweater, I think that there is when I went to A&M, there was a feeling of just sort of being at home, right? My family is originally from Alabama. My mom's side is from Montgomery. My dad's side migrated up to Ohio. But, you know, there was something about Alabama that just felt like home. So going back there as a military kid, it felt already like I was in a place where I was going to be supported. Also knowing that my mom and my uncle and my sister had already gone to the institution. My cousin was there. He was my roommate. There was a sort of family feel to the university. But I also, you know, the thing that I often try to explain to colleagues, and I hope comes through in the stories and things that I write about the institution, is the sort of viewpoint diversity of HBCUs, right? There's this thought that people often say that, oh, well, you know, you're going to a school where everybody looks like you. It's like, but not everybody like thinks like me, right? And so I'm often, I think it often surprises folks who are not in the HBCU community how different folks can think at HBCUs, and you can kind of authentically be yourself. You don't have to, you know, go and hang out with the same group of people who are hanging out in the student union building just because it's the only other Black people on campus, right? You're sort of you're able to build those connections through authentically being yourself, and I think that experience was something I couldn't replicate anywhere else.
One more question, and this is it. I wanted to know, was it one traumatic event that inspired you to write this book, or was it multiple events that led up to you saying, like, this is enough, I gotta publish this and I gotta put it out there?
Yeah, you know, I think that the seed for the idea, I wrote in the introduction about kind of where the seed for the idea came from, like knowing how important these institutions were, in particular to my family, right? The education of my family. You know, I think about Alabama A&M often, and the fact that in this crush of philanthropic giving over the last couple of years, they just recently received their largest ever single donation at $2.2 million. And if you go through any stretch of months, there are at least 15 to 20 institutions that will receive a gift of $5 million or more. So thinking about the fact that A&M, which has been around since 1875, received its largest ever gift in 2021 of $2.2 million says something about the landscape that they have existed in for the last 150 years. And so that experience of going from A&M, seeing the way that the state had underfunded that institution compared to the University of Alabama, Huntsville, was really jarring to me. And then when I got into work as a reporter and really started covering HBCUs, really started learning the ingredients that go into making the sausage that is higher education, right? It really reinforced for me that my experience wasn't necessarily a singular thing, that it wasn't just something that I was going through, that I wasn't just being like melodramatic as a college student saying that, oh, this thing's terrible and that's terrible, and the only good thing that we have on campus is the greasy spoon or whatever it might be, right? So I think all of those things taken together, like the accumulation of my experience on top of the reporting that I was able to do, and then I guess the moment that I learned that there were still 6 states that hadn't proven that they desegregated, like this was, I guess, 2017 at the time, it just sort of, something went off in my head that was like, oh, this is much, this is a longer book length thing to show how we got to this point. And I think I spoke with who ultimately became my agent, Leah, about a month later, and a year later we had sold the proposal to write the book. And so all of that sort of happened pretty fast, but the buildup was a sort of longer, this is lingering in the back of my mind. I think that there's a bigger story to tell here.
Excellent. I know that we have some questions. He's going to get to the questions, but before we get to the questions, I want to make sure that we go do a quick commercial break. Adam, your book is amazing. We want to make sure that all of the folks on this Zoom and anyone or StreamYard, anyone who watches it afterwards, that you get the book. We believe in buying books and supporting Black authors. I'm just going to put it out there. We want you to buy this book, and we want you to take a picture of it. I mean, I do the audible.
That's
books.
a great idea. That's a great idea.
That's her copy. I do audiobooks, so I'll take a picture of my Audible account, but take a picture of the book, tag Adam, tag us. We want to, and also it's very important for us to put comments on his, give him ratings in Amazon and give him thumbs up, because we need to make sure that we're supporting people who are fair and balanced, and who do the good work, and who do the good work and do the research. And that's one of the reasons why we really love this book. And I have so many questions. I just got a lot of questions. I'm going to be quiet because I know we don't even know how much more time we have you for.
But they're just Lloyd Gaines. That's all I can say. Lloyd Gaines. Like, really? Lloyd Gaines?
8-part series.
I know.
That is an 8-part series, for real.
Yeah.
Okay. So Didi, you take the questions on Facebook.
Okay, so we have a question from Chelsea. She wanted to know, Adam, how do students as well as parents put the pressure on so that the complaints and concerns of students are not only heard but met? I guess kind of like what Bernala was saying. So how if you have an HBCU student or someone in your family that's going to an HBCU, and there's something there that you want to that you feel needs to be done and corrected, how do we put the pressure on the institutions to make those corrections, to make those changes?
Yeah, I think that it's a very good question. I think that one of the first things to do is sort of understand, because each individual institution has its own sort of, the story is broadly similar, right? Each institution has been underfunded, but they've been underfunded in different ways, or they've been sort of discriminated against in different ways. And sometimes that may manifest in deferred maintenance. HBCUs on average have more deferred maintenance than predominantly white institutions. And so I think that there is a sort of talking to the administration, sort of really pushing the administration, but also pushing legislators, pushing lawmakers, talking to your local lawmaker to say, hey, this is an issue at our institution, and we need it to be addressed. We are your constituents as well. This is something that you should be addressing, because I think that for too long, as Catherine Lehman, who is the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights in the Department of Education, told me, right, states have become complacent in their expectation that the federal government won't sort of force them to comply with civil rights laws, which means that state lawmakers are also complacent in saying that, hey, well, if you're not going to push us to do more, then we're not going to do more. You can, if you keep yelling at the administrator, you keep yelling at them, then, the board can fire them. And then we can move into another cycle of another president that we can sort of put the same blame on. I think that until there is a push not only to address what's happening on campus, but the systemic factors that are creating the issues on campus, I think that it'll be difficult to sort of make any long, lasting change.
And then we have a question from Rick Watson. This is a good question. I think for those people who did not attend an HBCU, and you may want to, or you may have a child that may want to attend an HBCU, but then you're like, okay, well, HBCUs aren't getting the money like PWIs. What were the factors in deciding to go to an HBCU?
I think one of the biggest factors for me, I think that the way that America thinks about higher education is a little bit warped, right? Where there's so much emphasis, and this probably comes from the media focusing primarily on, the Ivy League institutions. And, there's this whole big rush to get into one of these Ivies because you're like, oh, that's going to set me up for success in the future. But there's a reason why places like Alabama A&M's motto is start here, go anywhere, because, you can get your education. You think 25% of Black STEM graduates, 50% of Black lawyers and doctors, 80% of Black judges come from historically Black colleges and universities. Mind you, these are 3% of the 4-year nonprofit institutions in the country, and they're still producing these outsized numbers of members of the Black middle class. And so I think that there's often this idea of, oh, well, if you go to HBCU, you're not going to be set up for success because you're not going to know how to interact with different people. And I think that's just plainly wrong-headed. I think that if a institution seems right for you culturally, if you may go out to Stanford and say, oh, this has actually happened with a student I was speaking to about a year and a half ago. They were like, oh, I'm choosing between Stanford and Morehouse. And I visited Stanford, and it's nice, but I was having a hard time finding my community out there. Even just going for that visit, right? It was like, well, we had to drive out to this church in order to finally find somewhere where I felt like I had a bit of a community there. He ultimately ended up deciding to go to Morehouse, and so far he's had an incredible experience. Right? I think that there's always been this tendency to look at the HBCU as the fallback institution, as opposed to the one that the students are choosing to go to. And I have never had any regrets about choosing to go to Alabama A&M.
And let's see, we have another question. I'm sorry, Dana, real quick from Facebook. At many HBCUs, there have been reports and students protest that financial aid monies have been stolen from students. Do you believe that HBCUs don't know how to properly manage the money?
So I will say a couple of things on this. One, there are also a lot of predominantly white institutions. This isn't like making light of the allegations, but typically in cases of financial aid monies being stolen, people go to jail. And the money is ultimately returned. That is what happens in those situations. I think that there's been a sort of knock on HBCUs of misappropriations of funds. As I was saying earlier, right, there's the old adage of it's expensive to be poor. And I will go back to Kentucky once more because as I wrote in the book, there's a quick 3 anecdotes from the book. So William T.B. Williams, early 1900, goes out to Kentucky. He's been a professor at Hampton. He's been a professor at Tuskegee. And the superintendent for schools in Kentucky is like, hey, what can we do to make Kentucky Normal and Industrial Institute more like Hampton? What can we do to make it more like Tuskegee? So they bring him in and he's like, look, you got a couple of issues. Your boys' dorm is literally in a mud puddle. Your girls' dorm is fire prone and lacks fire escape. Your electrical plant doesn't have any power. Your buildings are old. It's going to, he says, the students are of high average ability. The faculty's great, but it's going to take major departures from established plans in order to lift this institution to the standard that it should be, from this sort of level of underfunding that you've given it. And the state says, well, here's $40,000, fix it with that. You fast forward to the 1940s when the Truman Commission releases its report on funding white education and black education. And they say not a single state in the country is funding their white institutions and black institutions equitably or equally. And it's, from the least bad in the District of Columbia at 3-1 to the worst in the country in Kentucky at 42-1. You fast forward to today, and a lawmaker from Kentucky just a couple of years ago said that, well, if Kentucky State doesn't know how to manage its money, perhaps this institution should close. An institution that several times over has documented evidence from the federal government, from the state government, that they have been underfunding this institution. It has continued on into now when the state implemented its performance-based funding model, which effectively rates things like the amount of students you have, the 4-year to 6-year graduation rate, all of these things that predominantly white institutions have had a lot of time to build up currency around, right? These sort of inequitably built out systems for funding. And so typically historically black colleges will end up on the lower end of that. So you're receiving fewer dollars to do more, and then they're asking you to continue to do more with fewer dollars as they continue to siphon your money away, and then try to blame the institutions on the back end. Now, of course, are there places where perhaps an institutional leader could do things differently? Absolutely. But I think we have to understand that within the context of the way that the higher education system was set up and built.
Excellent. I have a question about the use of the word reparations, and our goal was to have conversations about reparations issues in June, and so that's when we came across your book, and we were doing this in kind of conversations up to Juneteenth, and because there's such heated energy around the word reparations, I wonder if we could, what does it look like to not call this reparations? Because to me, it sounds like it's a default on a promise. And so
Right.
I am naturally, and we're having a conversation next week on June 19th. I hope you'll listen in. It's a new take on reparations, but there are people like me who are naturally anti-reparations. But to me, this is not reparations. To me, this is like you said you were going, like you built this institution. First of all, you said it's illegal to educate Black people.
Right.
You said we're going
to. It's a default on a loan.
You will educate you, but we're not going to. And you build this thing and then you don't fund it. So like Dee said, it's a default on a loan. Wonder what, because we got a lot of conversation about people who are like, reparations, but when you break it down like a default on a loan, like I'm for people paying their debt, but not necessarily for this overall reparations conversation.
Yeah, I think that we're in a situation where the money that these institutions are owed is clearly a debt owed to the institutions. There are, legal studies. I think back to my mind is often in the early 1900s. My wife isn't very happy about it. But I think a lot about the sort of period just after states sort of started really implementing laws that formally codified segregation into the education system. So there's this thought that it was like, that happened in the 1800s. Like, no, Alabama was in 1901 and Kentucky was in 1904, right? These states were formally codifying segregation in the early 1900s at around the same time as they were sort of building out this broader infrastructure of higher education, of segregated higher education. And there was a period that a bill came up in Congress, where Southern lawmakers effectively said, hey, you don't have to worry about checking to see if we are matching our funds for the land grant institutions. So the Alabama A&Ms and other institutions of the sort, North Carolina A&T, Florida A&M. We can do that ourselves, and let us just keep our books. Let it be a state's issue. We'll match the funds. We won't send any information about how much we're matching back to Congress. We'll just let you know. And the bill ultimately, the bill that would have forced them to report that information ultimately fails. So the reason why we don't exactly know how much these institutions were shorted for such a long period of time was explicit. They were effectively saying, let us hide our hand, and the government allowed it to happen. And so I think that knowing all of the ways that they tried to block us from knowing that information, and then still knowing all of the ways that institutions were nickel and dimed over the years, right? Oh, we're going to pull $5,000 from your budget here to send students out of state, but only send $1,000 worth of students out of state each year. And so we're just going to keep that $4,000 and take $5,000 from you next year as well, right? Little things like that add up over time. And then if you just, more recently, just looking at the Forbes report, right? And the billions of dollars just since 1987 that the institutions have been underfunded, because that's when the IPEDS database kind of gets you back to. Billions upon billions of dollars. I think at Hank's latest, the last time I ran the numbers, it was something like $17 billion. I think it was 13 or 14 when they originally did the analysis, but now it's closer to 16, $17 billion that the institutions have been underfunded just since 1987. So you know what the students have been, or the institutions have been able to do in spite of that funding. Imagine what they would be able to do if they actually received the funding that they were supposed to get.
Right.
I look at North Carolina A&T. And they're the third highest public research producing institution in the state of North Carolina, in spite of all of that underfunding over the several decades, nearly a century. And I just often think of what could they do if they were given the funding that they deserve.
Wow. Wow.
You know that our time is wrapping up. Want to see if Dorian, Vernila, any questions?
No,
Mr. Harris.
go ahead.
Real quick, Mr. Harris, I would love to personally invite you to Bowie State for an open conversation with our students sometime in the fall. I think they'd really benefit from it, and I feel like I could personally benefit from it as well. So I'm definitely open to that.
Absolutely, yeah. I can share my. I get you all have my information if you'll.
We'll make sure he has it. Yes, that's great.
Fantastic, awesome.
Very good. Okay, so we're going to close with this video. It's a real quick video. And then on the other side of this video, would love for you to respond. A lot of people are saying that we want to know, like, who are the champions of funding? And here's
Francis,
one.
you have a question? Hello, Mr. President. I'm a student at PWIs State University. Dorian Francis, you have a question?
Technical difficulties.
Hello, Mr. President. I'm a student at PWIs State University in Bowie, Maryland, an HBCU. Good. What in the next 4 years do you plan on doing for HBCUs to keep us up and running and keep us running smoothly and keep benefiting us?
Well, I've done a lot because I funded you with long-term financing, which Obama didn't do and nobody else did. And the heads of the colleges, as you know, would come up here on a yearly basis looking for money. After the third year, I said, why do you guys keep coming up? I liked them. A number of them are friends of mine. I said, why do you keep coming up? I said, don't you have like 5-year, 10-year, some kind of funding? He said, no, every year we have to come up. And one of them, a great guy, he said, I come up and I feel like a beggar. And what did I do? I took care of them, right? Every year, more money than they asked for. I said, you need more than that. I got more money than that they asked for. Do I get credit for it? Absolutely not, but I feel very good about it.
Mr. President, one of the things when you were
Dina, you're muted.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So there's been a lot of debate over the long-term funding for HBCUs. It seems like every year there is more funding, but still not necessarily
not enough.
What do you say to the claims that that funding is now permanent, and what does that actually look like? What does that mean? These are claims that are being made throughout, on the left and the right. Next week's conversation will be far more political than this one. We hope you'll join us. But as it relates to the President Trump's claims, what you are in the research, what do you say?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think first, it's HBCUs did receive additional funding during the Trump administration. However, in several of the budget requests from the president, so when he outlined his priorities, HBCUs would have received cuts in funding. And so it was thanks to the congressional negotiations that HBCUs ultimately received that additional funding. It's not, in the same way that the budgets sort of come up annually, there is some recurring funding, but it's not the sort of long-term funding, right? Where it's like, oh, this is 10 years worth of funding down the road. It is a sort of more limited funding. So institutional leaders do come back for that congressional fly-in. They were actually up here, I guess it was in March this year, that they did their annual fly-in to meet with lawmakers. So it is not, we're not yet at a place where HBCUs can sort of sit back and say, hey, we've gotten our funding, everything is fantastic. Even amongst the philanthropic giving, right? You have sort of Howard, which has received an incredible amount of funding, Spelman and Morehouse, which has received a lot of funding. And then at the lower end, we have some institutions that have barely received anything, right? A&M, as I mentioned, $2.2 million is the largest donation that we had received. And so I think the financial woes are still there. There is, I often use a sort of toothbrush analogy and sort of thinking of it in relation to dental care. If at the very beginning, PWIs were given a toothbrush and HBCUs were denied a toothbrush. You're able to brush your teeth regularly, go over to the dentist, get your cleaning twice a year, and that's just your copay, and then you can go on and you're fine. But if you don't have a toothbrush and you also can't go and get your routine cleaning, then a couple of years down the road, you're probably going to have a cavity, right? And it's going to be more expensive to fix, but you didn't have the money to get a toothbrush in the first place. And so now you're trying to fix a cavity with like toothbrush money that they're like, oh, well, here's that $5 we were giving you. Go get you a two pack of toothbrushes over there at Walmart. And it's like, well, I need $150 because this is a cavity and I need a filling. And they're like, okay, well, we'll do that, but a couple of years down the road. So 2 years down the road, that cavity is now turned into the need for a root canal. And you're going to now need to pay $1,000 for not only the structural repairs, but to build the new tooth that goes on top of it. And they're like, okay, here's $150. So right now we're in the $150 cavity for a root canal phase. And we need to be talking about root canal money for the damage that has been done and sort of neglected over the stretch of time.
Okay. Very good. We are so excited that you were able to join us for this amount of time for this conversation. We do have many more questions. Again, Lloyd Gaines.
I know. So if you have not read the book, you need to read the book, and you'll be asking too, where's Lloyd Gaines?
I'm just like, really, people?
I know.
I had to go back and read that chapter again because I was like, I have surely missed something here.
Yeah, I actually, after I finished writing that chapter, I had to pause I had to stop writing for a couple of weeks because it was just emotionally taxing.
Well, I'm going to tell you, Didi, I read it before Didi did, and she kept asking me like it was like you were going to have the answer at the end. I hated to tell her that at the end of the book, you still don't know.
I really wish I did.
I was so mad.
So excellently researched, excellently written. Again, we
Absolutely.
celebrate work like yours because it is fair and balanced and it digs deep. It's using first. We really appreciate writing Ron Chernow, Doris Gurns Goodwin. I forget the order of her names, but where you have writers who are using the letters, the first person, digging deep. That it's like a preacher who says, "Believe what I say, but read it." Right. So you're like, believe what I say about HBCU fundings, but here's the legislation, here's the letter here. So you have it's so well researched. Again, I am not an HBCU graduate. I support HBCUs, but I have been hard on HBCUs.
Yes, she has.
I have been hard on HBCUs, but your writing changed my view of how hard I've been on HBCUs. So
I want to say really quickly, just a shout out to the Voorhees University students and the Bowie State University students that have gotten on to support their classmates, whatever. So I want to say shout out to those two. To those individuals that have been jumping on. So kudos to Dorian and to Bernila for making sure that they had some representation on here. So that was awesome.
Absolutely. And if you want to learn how to become an HBCU, a Humphrey Pinkston Fellow, then email media@basketballaffairs.com. Bernila and Dorian are our inaugural fellows, and we would love to have more. So again,
Adam, thank you so much. This has been awesome.
Absolutely. It was such a pleasure to meet you.
Much appreciated.
And everyone is saying that this has been absolutely great, so beneficial. So this was
much
great.
Appreciated.
And make sure you go buy the book, whether you want to do Audible.
This Barnes and Nobles has it, and it's like $18.95.
And take a picture of it and tag Adam and Bongo Books in it so that he knows that, yes, they got my book. So make sure you go buy the book. If you do Audible, do the Audible like Dina and take a snapshot. You can still tag it on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all of it. So definitely make sure you do that. Thank you so much,
other
Adam.
people who like me, who like to write in the book, just like to write in there. It's like the two, what is it? The two, oh my gosh, the 256
on Audible. You can do the
256 thing. I was like, oh no.
Different generations.
I mean, I got to write in my thing so I can come back. But yeah, this is it. So go buy it, Tom.
Thank you.
It's a family thing. We're going to end the broadcast. Adam, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
good one.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so